Hello, my name is Christopher and I work at SLAPE as a biomechanics researcher, and I'm here today to talk to you about an exciting new feature that we have that we would like to call anatomical scaling. But before we describe that in more detail, what that means, we need to talk a little bit of a biomechanical background into what it is we do here at SLAPE. So what we do is that we measure the vertical displacement or the vertical movement of the horse's head and pelvis in order to try and extract asymmetries in this movement while the horse is trotting. And then we relate these asymmetries to any eventual weight-bearing lameness. And when you go back to the scientific literature or any books reading up on biomechanics and how movement relates to lameness, you're going to see that they use millimeters or perhaps centimeters as the unit of measurement. And this is quite convenient because millimeters and centimeters it's a common absolute unit of measure, and it's good because most of us have an intuitive feeling for how much a millimeter or a centimeter is. So that means if I see a horse that's trotting and I see, oh, it has a 1 centimeter asymmetry, we know approximately how much that is. So the question then becomes, are there any drawbacks with using this absolute unit of measure? Well, it turns out that there is. So for example, when it comes to then clinically evaluating this asymmetry, do we evaluate 1 centimeter of asymmetry the same for all different types of horses? Compare this small horse here compared to the big horse. Would you say then that 1 centimeter movement for both of these horses is the same? Probably not. And the way that research has sort of come up with a way to mitigate this problem is to, instead of looking at this absolute measure of asymmetry, instead look at the relative asymmetry. So there's a trick we can do. We can look at how much asymmetric movement there is compared to how much symmetric movement there is in, for example, the head and the pelvis. And then you just divide the asymmetric part by the symmetric part and you have a relative measure of asymmetry. This is what SLAPE does today for several reasons that we will get into a little bit later. And this is a good approach to solve this sort of how do the different asymmetries relate to different horse sizes, because typically smaller horses might move a little bit less than a big horse. Unfortunately, there are drawbacks to this method as well. And in order to illustrate that, we're going to look at a couple of videos here. So I want you to look at the horse on the left first, and focus your eyes on the head. You'll see that it has quite a bouncy gait. You see the head clearly moving up and down for each stride. Compare that to the horse on the right. You will see that the head of that horse is kept way more steady. So it's not moving up and down as much. Have a look when the horse is trotting back here. You see it's almost keeping its head perfectly still. Again, have a look at the horse to the left and you see a way more sort of pronounced vertical movement. So you can imagine now what happens when we try to relate the asymmetric movement as a relative measure here. You might have a horse that has a very, very high relative asymmetry, but the total movement is small. That will get a very exaggerated asymmetry measure compared to the horse which has a big movement. And the same absolute amount of asymmetry. So here's an illustration to sort of help us understand this. On the left side here, we see the old method that we at SLAPE use today. And you see the light green asymmetric curve here. That's the asymmetry that we want to quantify. And then we relate that in the movement relative scaling by looking at the gray one here. So you see how big is this light green one compared to the gray one, and we get this movement relative asymmetry measure. And this comes again then with the drawbacks that I just talked about. And this is also important because at SLAPE we cannot use absolute millimeters today. We film with pixels. So we're going to see the movement asymmetry in pixels, but we can then get it to this movement relative asymmetric version if we want. So what we come up with now, which we believe is a better approach and that mitigates both of these issues that we talked about, both the small movers but also the horse relative problem that you might have with an absolute unit of asymmetry, is by looking at the horse size relative asymmetry. So instead we take this, we take the asymmetric part of the movement, but we relate it to the size of the horse instead. And when we do this, we get what we like to call anatomical scaling.